Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the podcast titled When Wildfire Comes. My name is Dr. Christopher Potter, and I'm a wildfire scientist with over 30 years of experience working for our space agency, NASA, and with many local communities who have been impacted by wildland fires in California and the West. My group has studied wildfire on the urban interface using satellite imagery and ground measurements for nearly all of the most destructive fires in the Western United States over the last 10, 15 years, and we've published dozens of science papers on these events. I myself do still live in a high-risk wildfire zone in Northern California, and I'm aware every day of the risks and possibilities of a fire coming to the town I live in. But today we're going to hear from our special invited guest, who is a retired CAL FIRE assistant region chief for the northern region of California, John Messina, about his experience in combating a very intense, maybe the most intense fire ever experienced in Northern California. That is the Bear Fire, which was a lightning started fire in 2020. And Captain Messina will be telling us, or Chief Messina will be telling us about his experience in fighting on that fire and just how unusual it was in its intensity and ferocity. And then we'll follow up with what it also did to the whole region of Northern California, particularly the San Francisco Bay Area, to the air quality and the look of the air on certain days in September of 2020. So just a few little facts as background for the Bear Fire. It started to really get out of control and very intense on September 8th of 2020. It was part of the North Complex fire, and it exploded that night, generating immediate evacuation orders for communities east of Oroville, California. It raged overnight and burned over 200,000 acres in a 24-hour period. It would ultimately kill 16 people and an uncountable number of wild animals and in the area that it was burning. Nearly 2,500 structures were destroyed. About most of those were residents and homes in Butte County. So that's the little background introduction on the fire. But without further ado, I want to turn it over and ask our special guest, Chief Messina, to tell us a little bit about his background. He has a very, very long and storied background working for CAL FIRE. So, Chief, take it away. We'd love to hear about it.
Thank you, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I guess good morning. And I will say from your introduction, you're the first person that I've heard describe the North Complex as the most, um, you know, significant fire in Northern California history. And what I mean by that, maybe not in the terms of acreage and destruction and death toll, but when it comes to fire behavior, I mean, my colleagues have all discussed that were there the first day. It superseded anything we've ever seen in Northern California. And there just wasn't a lot of people that day that, when you describe September 8th, because of all the other fires going on in California, that actually witnessed it. But for the handful of us that did, it wasn't even close. So, the Dixie, the camp, some of the North Bay complex fires, it was amazing. But anyway, a little bit about myself. I grew up in rural northeastern California in a town called Alturas, really small community. And my dad was a grocer, had a grocery store, and I remember we used to deliver groceries to fire camp. That was back in the day. Cisco didn't show up. We'd load up a pickup truck with 1,000 pounds of ice and some ground beef that we packaged up, and we delivered to fire camp. And I don't know, I was probably 10, 11, 12, and I went with my dad to a fire that was up in the Warner Mountains, and I remember thinking, man, this is really cool. I could do this. So when I graduated from high school, I got a job as a seasonal firefighter with Bureau of Land Management, which helped me pay for college. I was attending San Diego State. Left, Alturas and thought I got to get as far away as I can from, rural northeastern California. So I went to San Diego,
Uh-huh.
and I stayed with BLM for 9 years and became a permanent firefighter with them, and then decided that, you know, it was probably some of my best times of my career, but unfortunately, BLM doesn't manage some of the most desirable places to live in the United States. They have some pretty um, you have to grow to love it. And I realized that probably didn't want to live in some of the places that I have to work. So I switched agencies and went over to Cal Fire. Um,
Mhm.
have 34 total years prior to retiring in the fire service. The majority of that was with Cal Fire in the Butte unit. I spent a couple of years in the Nevada Yuba Placer unit as the battalion chief for air attack base out of Grass Valley. Um, but through my career, I spent most of it, what we call, in the trenches. I was always kind of an operational guy, hand crews, fire engines, spent a little bit of time on hell attack with the feds, and then station time was a field battalion chief, air attack battalion chief, and then actually bit the bullet because I was one of those guys that didn't understand administration and was kind of critical of administration. So I took the administration division chief of administration of Butte unit, which oversees, all the HR, hiring, budgets, policy, all the stuff that isn't really um, glorified in the fire service nowadays. And I'll be honest with you, it's probably one of the best assignments I've ever had. I learned so much, became such a more well-rounded chief officer because of that. Moved out, and after the campfire, I moved into the community of Paradise as the Paradise Fire Chief through a cooperative agreement. Um, did that for about 2.5 years. And then, the opportunity arose to become the unit chief and the county fire chief, overseeing the proper agreements between Butte County, Gridley, Paradise, um, soon to be Oroville at the time. Did that for 2.5 years, and I left in 2021 and went to the North Region as as you said, the assistant region chief, overseeing all of Northern California fire protection operations. And I did that for 2 years and then retired November of 23. And since then, been doing some consulting, me and a couple other peers that work together, doing some wildfire resiliency consulting, evacuation planning, and assessment. And we're taking some of those practical skills that we learned, over our careers, as we were the ones that saw it and did it, and we're helping other communities plan and hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls and things that we saw over 34-year career. During my career, I was on a incident management team for, I don't know, 14 years, and was operations section chief the majority of it. The last 3 years, I was a deputy incident commander on Team 5 with another Cal Fire chief, Mike Parks, and we were able to do COVID response support, disaster recovery, obviously some of the major fires in California. Um, yeah, it's been a blessed career for me.
Mhm.
I have been exposed to some, like everyone. I just look back over my career in between my time as an incident management team member and Oroville emergency spillway disaster to the Camp Fire to the Dixie Fire to the North Complex. Some of the most notable incidents in California have been either an operations incident commander or agency administrator on. So I've some people may not call that blessed, maybe it's cursed, but for me, it's really exposed myself to just some really unique incidents and opportunities, and really helped me develop, as a, I would say, chief officer in Cal Fire.
That's great. Yeah, we're privileged to speak with you about with all that wealth of experience, and of course, thank you for your service all those years. Um, because our communities are far better off for the dedication that Cal Fire from top to bottom. As we're very lucky to have you, and we'll be in the future, I'm sure. Your those who come after you. So that's great. Can we then? How about we go to then? Because this is how I sort of introduced and we'll title the subject of the podcast to that day of, say, September 8th. Do you want to start in the morning or the afternoon? When's a good time to
Let's,
start talking about the
I think
bear
it's
fire
important
on that
just
day?
to, let's just go back to August 17th, the
Okay.
night of the 16th or the 17th. California had been under, you know, pretty significant heat wave. The previous winter was really dry. I think the snowpack was 50 to 70% of normal. And so, Northern California, the conditions were right to have a big fire season. And there was a real strong high pressure set up over Nevada. And this is October 16th, well, a couple days before that. We saw record breaking temperatures. And then there was some remains of a tropical storm off the coast that came in off the coast and created a real dire situation when it as respects to dry lightning. So, California is it's foreign to dry lightning. However, most of it comes up through the monsoonal moisture from, the Pacific, or excuse me, the Southwest, comes up the spine, maybe spills over the spine of the Sierras, and you can have some problems. But some of our most significant and most consequential lightning outbreaks come off the coast. They don't happen very often, but when they do, it's really, really a bad situation. In this case, it's exactly what happened. And so, all throughout Northern California, I think the lightning occurred over about a 3-day period, but what came through Butte County, Plumas, was the night of the 16th and the morning of the 17th. I think Butte County had 34 fires. Some of those were duplicate reports, but we were chasing 34 fires. The majority of those were in the foothills in the grass. We had some significant fires that were in the Butte Creek drainage up between Sterling City and Forest Ranch and Butte Meadows. And the Plumas National Forest, I think, had about 21 fires out of this system. So, between, August complex, Santa Clara lightning complex, those were all part of this lightning storm. So Northern California, well, actually California in general was just slammed with fires, resource drawdown, many fires that weren't being staffed. It was a really tough first couple of weeks of that lightning siege. Matter of fact, if you go back and look at the statistics, I think the 2020, we'll call it the Northern California lightning siege, was hands down the most significant lightning siege that we've seen in modern time when it comes to acreage burn, fire behavior, structures lost, fatalities. Supersedes anything we saw in 87, 2008. But
Sure, for
because the
sure.
public's getting used to it, we're kind of just, it was a bad year. We're getting used to these real terrible fires, and they all happen at once, so they kind of drowned each other out. Um, because we had those 34 fires going, and some of them were in really, believe it or not, Butte County. It's like typical front country counties. It starts off in the grasslands, transitions up in the foothills, brush. But believe it or not, as you go further east in Butte County, even though it's one of the smallest counties in California, it's some really rugged terrain. We don't have a lot of them, but what we do have is really rugged. It's the Feather River Canyon, Feather River drainages. That's why there's the largest state watershed project in California is Lake Oroville. It's because it's got some significant drainages that funnel water down. So we have some really, really poor terrain, places where nobody really wants to fight fire. Like I don't anyway. It's reminiscent of the Pacific, or excuse me, the northwestern portion of California. The only difference is their entire area up there is crappy. We just have small chunks of it that's what we consider miserable terrain. So
Right.
we'd worked with the Tehama unit, and we brought a team in because there was only 4 teams, Cal Fire teams deployed in California. We brought a team in just to help us with logistics in case things got out of hand. We were looking across the valley, seeing the fires in the August complex, Plumas National Forest had some fires. They were really burning, you know, very aggressively. And we had fires in the same type of fuel, same type of terrain. For some reason, they weren't burning real aggressive, but we expected any day, you know, that they were going to get off and run, and we better be prepared for it. Anyway, it was, you know, started about the 16th, and we ran that all the way till September 8th. And around August 30th, we had all of the fires in our unit and the Butte unit protection area contained. They were in patrol status, you know, which means just a handful of people. We were lucky. Other units and force were still battling major fires, not having a lot of success. I don't know why we were successful, being honest with you. I mean, well, credit the firefighting, obviously, but you know, we had, you know, lack of resources. Those that were out there were doing a great job. It's really bad terrain, but I think we were at the time one of the luckiest areas that had been part of this fire siege to get a hands around ours.
Mhm.
So I just remember, you know, we do our briefings and we would really stroke the guys, you know, and commend them on walking down these terrible drainages, doing a great job containing these fires. And we were bragging, you know, boasting internally for morale purposes. You guys did a great job. We're the only ones that contained our fires in our unit. But since you did such a great job, you're probably going to get redeployed immediately to some of these other areas, and you're going to be gone for a month, right? So your
Right.
reward is, you know, and that's normal, right? That's everybody gets from.
Hmm.
If we're going to get off these fires and then go right to a new one, you're going to be there for the rest of the summer. You know, and you know, we would laugh about it, trying to build morale of misery loves company. Um,
Yeah.
since we had slowed down in the unit, I had left the weekend of September 5th and 6th and went up to Lake Almanor just for 2 days. I've been in the unit for, you know, 40, 50 days without a day off. Things had settled down. And I had gotten back late Sunday, and late Sunday night, I called one of my counterparts in the Plumas National Forest. They had their complex going. They complexed all their fires into one, and there was two that still had some activity on it. They were pretty much in patrol status. They were taking a little bit of suppression action on one, and that was the Bear and the Claremont. They had actually touched, so they combined them at what we call the North Complex. And
Hmm.
I asked them, and I apologize for my language.
No
How's
problem.
that piece of shit? I told him, how's that? I asked him, how about that piece of shit fire in the Feather River Canyon? Because that's what it is. And they had some open line that they were monitoring um, down what's called a Cleghorn, oh, Cleghorn Horseshoe. You know, I forget exactly what the Cleghorn Bar, I think it was what it called. They
Okay.
said, hey, they, you know, they too steep to put anybody on it, but it's in patrol status. We're putting some helicopters on it. You know, because we knew some weather was coming, some a wind event. And let me go back. The problem with fires that start in August and drag on for weeks is as we reach the front end of the fall weather pattern, and we all know this in Northern California, you know, September, and we start seeing those dry cold fronts come in, and that's when we get our, you know, our north wind events or our Diablo wind events, and we have a
Hmm.
lot of our problems. And so those are always concerns of when fires start in late August. We need to nip these in the butt quick because as soon as we hit September, it opens those doors up for those significant wind events, as you would know.
Hmm.
So that's why I called. You know, I knew we had a fairly significant wind event coming. It was a wind event similar to what we experienced on the Camp Fire. You know, high pressure in the Great Basin, low pressure cutoff low coming off the West Coast, and because of the way the drainages align in Butte County, a northeastern eastern, you know, wind event channels everything right down the drainages, kind of uh, compounds, you know, the situation with those drainages. And so, you know, we talked it out a little bit and didn't think much of it. And then so the following day on September 8th, it was early in the morning, got a quick call from one of the Forest Division Chief of the Feather River Canyon saying, hey, wind surface and across the Feather River. And they were in the middle fork of the Feather River, which is just terrible terrain. And it's coming out, but it's kind of heading to the southwest toward Little Grass Reservoir, which would be out of Butte County.
Oh,
And so we assembled our executive team together and talked about it a little bit. We really, I don't think anybody really knew, Bucks Lake, where this kind of got out, it's a long ways from Buchanan. We've had fires up there. The plumes out. They've never been a concern to Buchanan. We don't even turn and look at them. It's just such a long ways away.
right.
But we assembled. Hey, got some weather, and we couldn't really see the smoke yet. And by the time everybody got there, we talked out a little bit. Hey, if, we'll put a little contingency to group together. Let's start building it. We won't deploy them yet, but round up some people. You remember, and everybody's exhausted, right? We're having to call people back, and they're like, I've been on that fire up in Butte Meadows for 21 days. Well, my legs are broke. I need some time off. So, we were fully staffed, but to bring back those surge capacity, no one really wanted to answer the phone. So we rounded up one of our 8th Battalion chiefs named Jason Dyer and brought him in. We talked about moving some of our dozers up towards Feather Falls and, where can we put some contingency line in if we needed it. And so we were planning. Thought we had lots of time. And so the duty chief, that's the person in charge of the operations of the day for the unit. He and I were standing outside Oroville headquarters. And now that, this is about 8:30, 9 o'clock now, we can see the smoke column and some of the biggest ash I've ever seen was falling on the ground. And we kind of
Wow.
looked at each other and like, that doesn't look like it's heading south. Oroville's pretty much due east of Bucks Lake. You know,
Hmm.
we probably need to get a little more serious on what's going on. And so, we deployed some resources up to Feather Falls. We started doing some contingency line, more of just in case, right?
Hmm.
And we called the Plumas and we kind of talked about, what was going on. And obviously the smoke column now is becoming ominous and it's getting bigger. And all of a sudden, all of Oroville is, browned out, I call it, in smoke. And the ash was so heavy, even worse than what we saw in the campfire, that it looked like it was snowing in Oroville. You could walk across the compound and there was a quarter inch of white ash on the ground. It looked like snow. We took a picture of it. And
That's
so,
amazing.
and it really was. And then we're like, man, we've got some problem. The good thing is the incident management team that was helping us on our lightning complex was still kind of in the area, shifted most of their uh, their attention over to the August complex to help some of that stuff that was coming off the Forest Service land and the private property. So they were still around, and we would call them like, "Hey, just let you know, we've got this problem. I don't know if it's going to be a problem." The Plumas had an incident management team on the North Complex or the Bear Fire, so we were in a little bit of communication with them. And we got on a conference call about 1:30, 2 o'clock with the team in the Plumas National Forest. And they had just been told by the team air attack, they felt the fire would be in Oroville by sundown. So that caught us all on our heels. And, we had stood up our command group and the Buchanan Sheriff was in the expanded with us. And so we said, okay, so that's a significant problem for Butte County and all the people between Lake Oroville and Bucks Lake. And, we discussed how we will handle that of the fire churning. We still felt the fire was burning a little bit to the south, but it was well established in the Feather River and the little North Fork of the Middle Fork of the Feather River. I know that sounds like there's a bunch of those drainages, Middle Fork, North
And
Fork,
fork.
South Fork. And, it was already established in those outside of Butte County. Some of it we didn't know because you couldn't see. I mean, the smoke was laid over. You just, we had scouts out looking and the wind was blowing so hard, it was pushing the smoke down where you can't see across drainages.
Hmm.
And that's similar to kind of what happened with some of the campfire and the Dixie fire where the smoke obscures, you know, vision where you don't really know where the fire is at. And that's really where some of the new technology with the IR satellites and the fire ship that's flying in California too, to help look through the smoke and give firefighters an idea of where the fire is for situational awareness. Because, like you said, in the past, it's always been visual, and what the guys on the ground are telling you, well, if they can't see anything, like, I don't know where the fire's at. I mean, it was really odd. We couldn't really nail it down because we were under the smoke call. Now, I will tell you, my counterpart in Lassen Modoc, he was stationed out of the unit chief Scott Packwood out of Susanville, called me and said, "You got a big problem." And we're like, because he could see the fire on the backside, he was in the clear air. And we're like, well, what do you mean? And he was sending me pictures of this pyrocumulus that was sheared off at about 25,000 feet, and it was scary looking. We couldn't see that. And
No doubt.
I don't think, yeah, nobody else could see that on the windward side of this column. All we could see was dark black smoke.
Mhm.
So, and let me get back. You know, that the weather event that was coming through, it wasn't really high temperatures. It was, you know, mid 80s, you know, what normal for early September. We had really dry fuels, but we had really, really windy conditions, you know, gusts up to 70, 80 mile an hour, sustained
Mhm.
35, which, people think, it's just, we had 80 mile an hour winds. Well, sustained 35, gusts to 70, 80, that's significant. Sustained 35 mile an hour wind is significant. Aligned with
Sure.
those drainages, I'm sure there were areas that was sustained more than that.
Mhm.
And for you and your listeners, please don't quote me on some of my statistics. It's been 6 years or 5 years, and I may be off, a tad bit. So that there's my
Yeah,
disclaimer for
that's
that.
understandable.
So when we realized, okay, this is going to get to Buchanan, so we actually had time. We initiated evacuation orders for basically everything on the east side of Lake Oroville all the way up to the county line. That's what our responsibility was. But I would say the majority of people evacuated. There's some that don't, and that still happens in California. They wait till the last minute, or they're going to try to ride it out. And we had a significant number of those people that live in those foothill communities that I'm going to ride it out. We're used to
Mhm.
fires, and so we still had a large population in our rural communities up there. Feather Falls, Berry Creek, Mountain House, um, Robinson Mill, just the majority evacuated, but some didn't.
Yeah.
And so we built a contingency plan, and we discussed with our neighboring Forest Service counterparts what we'll do is they didn't have any resources. We had very little. We'll use the county line as kind of a zone of operation for the night, knowing that this fire is going to get there. And then we didn't go in unified command, but we stayed in touch, in close contact with each other. And then in the morning, we'll let the dust settle, and then we'll reconvene and see how we structure this moving forward. It
Mhm.
was just things were moving too fast. Everything was too dynamic to go have a big meeting up in Quincy to figure out, chain of command and who was going to do what. And it was just, we had to make a decision. The fire was coming. Um, and so to give you an idea about resource drawdown, so during the campfire, we ordered 100 strike teams of engines, which is 5 engines and a leader,
Mhm.
500 engines. And we did that 8 in the morning. By sundown, we had about 258 fire engines operating on the fire within 12 hours. There were no other fires in California other than a fire in LA County.
Yeah.
For this fire, we needed the exact same amount of resources, and we had 58 total. Forest Service even had less because of all the other fires in the state that were going on. They'd already, you know, they'd already had their hands on those resources, and we just weren't getting them. So, we're 200 fire engines short of what we were using
Mhm.
on the campfire during the first day.
Yeah.
Most of
Wow.
those, most of those engines were local resources. In Buchanan, we have about 32 fire engines between the state and local government mission. We had deployed every single one of them. I think we had one that was running every medical aid. We run, you know, 30, 40,000 calls in the county a year. One engine was running all of those medical aids.
Mhm.
Any other call, you know, outside of, Chico City was helping us, Oroville City at the time helping us. So we deployed as much as we could. We had some NATA unit resources. Um,
Did you
and
have airborne resources?
what was that question?
Did you have airborne resources at the time?
So no, because now the stuff that was on the clear air side, yes, there's some aircraft dropping, it was just too smoked out, too windy and too smoked out where we needed them. A few helicopters, and so what they'll do in the states when there's all these fires going on, they'll prioritize based off of values at risk and success. In this case, high values at risk, limited success due to just access.
I see. Yeah.
So no aerial assets other than a handful of helicopters. And it gets complex when you have two agencies that are in unified command trying to operate aircraft independently. So we allowed that aircraft operation stay under the control of the incident management team that was up in Chester, or excuse me, up in Quincy, managing the complex.
Hmm.
So they were able to use some of it on the lee side, but it's not in their defense, they just couldn't get around to help us on our side. And we knew that going in. So we called the incident management team and said, hey, not so fast. We think you're getting out of here, but tomorrow morning, I think we're going to have a really big mess. So some of their employees, excuse me, team members came back and joined the fight with us.
Mm.
So we did have access to it, like Cal Fire Copter, and we put a couple operation guys on it, and we sent them up. This was 3 o'clock, and they were sending me pictures. They were able to get under the smoke. They were sending me pictures of, um, the fire front that was coming down into Butte Canyon. And I'm not exaggerating. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you it was anywhere from 12 to 16 miles wide, and it looked similar to the flaming front of a grass fire burning off the top of the crown of the tree. And so the areas that is burning, that I call it's not, but I call it was pristine forest. It was heavily forested with, timber, gorgeous, and it was thick and dense. And that fire, I still have those pictures today. They were able to get under it and look to the north and snap a photo of it. And all of us looked at it and said, man, I've never seen anything like that. Of just a continuous wall of a crown fire, 12 miles long, coming off the hill. Yes, there were spot fires, way out in front of it, but it wasn't like what we're used to where smoke drowns it all out. You really can't tell. You could actually see this line of fire. And so when we saw that, we all looked at each other and said, we're in trouble. Like this is not good. This is early afternoon and we're working with the sheriff and we got evacuations going on. And we looked at each other, and when we talk about strategy and tactics, we had been really skilled at evacuations, between the campfire and the wall fire and the Ponderosa and the Oroville spillway. We have a great working relationship with the Office of Emergency Management and the law enforcement in Butte County, and we work seamless together. So it was like, there was no panic. It was, we do this all the time. Let's start the evacuation process. And so we didn't race all of our apparatus up, the 58 fire engines we had. We didn't run them all the way up to the fire front. We decided there's nothing we're going to do with 58 fire engines. We're going to facilitate evacuations, moving people, and then we'll get into structure defense when that time comes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a piece of cake. We're like, oh, this is easy. It was just a real interesting day. The sun started to set about 4 or 5 p.m. We're still trying to figure out where the fire is. I mean, we kind of know where it's at. And then we have Jason Dyer, like I said, he was a battalion chief, called and says, there's a fire running down one of these drainages, and it's already past Featherfall. He finally gets to a spot where he can see, the smoke isn't obscuring it. And he can see. That caught us off guard a little bit. We wouldn't say caught us off guard. We're like, okay, we're there. And so we start deploying our what few resources we had to the Feather Falls area. And Feather Falls literally got decimated. And it happened really fast. So as we're, we needed 100 engines for Feather Falls. So, as we put 25 fire engines up to 30. Then we get a call over by Sean Norman, who I think was on this podcast, saying, "Hey, we've got fire in the Little Fork of the Middle Fork, and it's already at Mountain House." And so, like, oh, Mountain House needed 100 fire engines, but they're going to get 20. And so, with that, we told everybody, hey, remember, we're not going to try to do perimeter control. We're not going to try to suppress it. We're going to evacuate, protect critical infrastructure and people's home. That's all we're going
Yeah.
to try to do. And that's even that was just a a shot in the wind to even do that with that type of fire behavior. And we told everybody, remember, public safety and then your safety. It there just was no reason to say get in there and you know
Hmm.
save everybody's property.
Right.
So as the night went on, I try to reflect back. We had since 2017, the unit had 6 incident management teams deployed from 2017 to 2020. Since then, they've had another 6, between 20 and 25 with the Park Fire and the Dixie and the camp and all that. But not the camp, that was 18. So we were well exercised. I will put the group of people that we had during that time were some of the most seasoned firefighters when it comes to chaos. We have their seasoned firefighters all throughout the United States. Some don't get to experience chaos and these fires that just supersede any expectations and do things that you've never ever seen before. Not just in a remote area. We see outlandish fire behavior in remote areas all the time. You don't see it in an urban area where people are trying to evacuate, right? It just doesn't happen that regularly.
Hmm.
So I'll be honest with you, Chris, it was like another day at work. Everybody fell into their roles. There was no screaming on the radio. Law enforcement knew what to do. EMS knew what to do. Our search and rescue, who helps us with our evacuations, what to do. And it was impressive sitting back as the unit chief and the agency administrator to listen to the radio traffic with the operation guys, everybody on the field. They were relaying really catastrophic information. Nobody got ramped up because, unfortunately, we were good at chaos. It's not something to boast about, but
Yeah.
you hope that nobody's good at chaos. That means you just didn't experience it, which is good. It was very, very impressive to watch these guys go to work.
I bet.
It was one of my proud careers. Like, we got this. We're gonna be okay. As the fire comes down, I'm listening to moving resources around. They're having success, but something that caught us off guard is we had more residents stayed than we expected. That the foothill communities, you know how they are in California. They're very independent, self-sufficient, and I think I would probably be the same too. I'm going to ride this out. And the problem with this fire was, and you can't really convey this during an evacuation. Hey, we're not just evacuating because a fire's going to be around your house that you'll probably be okay. This is really bad. Like, and then what happened is the fire would hit these homes that people stayed, and they realized, holy shit, this is bad. I need help now.
Yeah.
And so when the sun went down, we went into, again, campfire rescue mode of the remaining civilians that didn't evacuate through Feather Falls, Berry Creek, Brush Creek, all those communities, Mountain House. And that became the MO for basically from sundown till the morning. It was a mini campfire
Mhm.
in respects to, people being trapped, radio traffic, we need help. It just was really reminiscent on a smaller scale than the campfire on a small scale. I personally think it was just as catastrophic. Had that fire been on the east side of Paradise, you would have seen 1,000 fatalities in Paradise.
Yeah.
100% destruction of the town. It's just we were lucky, if you want to call that luck. They were still very tragic. It hit a portion of the county that wasn't as densely populated.
Right, right. Yeah. So when we are going to look then at the next, if we go to the next day, then the ninth, and but I assume your crews are trying to work at night at this point, or doing evacuations and there's no stop until what's supposed to be sunlight the next day, I guess, right? But there really wasn't sunlight the next day. Is that about right?
I would say yes. And so all night, we did rescues, and there was some really amazing work, some crew heroism by all first responders. Berry Creek Fire Station, the Cal Fire Station, we had turned that into a mass casualty um, location, and we were rounding up burn victims. There was a lot of burn victims on this fire,
Yeah.
and we were using that as a safe place for them, and then transporting burn victims with ambulances and an escort, a fire engine escort. That I wasn't there personally. The guys that were there, they explained it there. At one point, they were doing CPR and intubating, a burn patient on the floor with, about 40 other, some burned, some just taking refuge in the station. We had a few fire engines there. We had 5 or 6 ambulances. And it became this mass casualty treatment center. While the fire, was burning around the fire station, guys are trying to save it. And you just listen to the stories of, how it was, and you look at them and you just shake your head, and fire didn't used to do this. So it was pretty amazing to hear those stories. And the feelings that did remain, they went through some really, really tragic and devastating experiences up there. I would say the next morning, I'll be honest with you, the only thing that stopped the fire from coming all the way into Oroville and making it, probably the most catastrophic and deadly fire was Lake Oroville. It hit a massive fire break. And so when the morning, the sun finally raised, the only thing that was really left was the South Fork of the Feather had fire in it. And, on the flank on the south side, the north side had slopped over into Highway 70 corridor. So now we just had a flanking fire that, the head fire was done. The damage was done in 18 hours. The dust cleared. We got in the morning, the fire traveled, we figure 18 miles and burned 210,000 acres. Excuse me. The fire traveled 24 miles, burned 210,000 acres in 18 hours.
That's just
I think people underestimate that. There's nothing that even compares to that in the United States other than the Great Fires of 1910. But we talk about the campfire burn. They were saying a football field every 60 seconds. Oh, the campfire burned, by sundown, it burned 84,000 acres. This burned 210,000, almost 3 times as much in a heavier fuel type. It was just phenomenal. I mean, I'm not going to use the term unprecedented because everybody uses that, but I can tell you, I will go to my deathbed saying nobody has seen that. Nobody, maybe they will, but right now in modern times, no one's seen the fire behavior and the rates of spread in that fuel model that happened on the North Complex.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of acreage, had not the August Complex fire been burning and this SCU fire been burning, that fire alone with over 200,000 acres burned would have gone right to the top of of all-time fire areas, right? But it was already being eclipsed by some of the other complex fires around, that eventually, like the August Complex fire, got to over 1 million acres at one point, right, or at the end. But 200,000 was just unprecedented in less than 24 hours, right?
Oh yeah, it was. And for your reader, or excuse me, your listeners, you can get on some of the YouTube stuff and look at the alert wildfire cameras, and there's a couple cameras that show some of some of the fire behavior. There's time lapse video of it on it, and it gives you an idea, and you can really see the fuel, the terrain, and
Mhm. That much fuel being pushed, ejected up into the upper atmosphere. Um, the next day, the whole region was seeing the effects of it, and just so listeners are um, plugging this into the experience that people in the San Francisco Bay Area were having that next day. When they woke up and we woke up, I was living there. We called it the Orange Skies Day. And because all that thick smoke from the North Complex fire was mixing with the marine layer fog and blocking out all the blue light we usually get, and all we had left was orange light. And I guess we were lucky to have any light at all, because you were probably in the situation where you had to go through another day of firefighting in the dark. So, is that right?
Yeah, you know what? It obviously wasn't as dark as the first day, but
Oh, okay.
you just nailed it. You know what happens when that smoke starts to mix in? It gets blended in with the inversion, and then I think it creates the inversion because the sun can't get down. So that smoke sat in the North Valley of California, Butte County, some of the drainages. It wasn't black, but it is dark and just miserable conditions. That it's
Yeah.
like taking a big deep breath of your campfire when you have to cough. There's no getting out of it. Especially, for public, you can take shelter inside. For firefighters, it was, if I remember right, it was about 7 days of just brutal, brutal air quality. And
Yeah.
obviously other fires in Northern California were contributing to that, right? They start to mix together. Um, and it's just, there was one point we were standing outside and like day 5 of the terrible smoke, everybody's eyes are still red. You're starting to get the crud and you don't know why. And, you know, we looked at each other and we started like, gosh, I mean, between campfire, this fire, and then we knew the extent of the fire, over 2,300 structures destroyed. We had 16 fatalities, 42 burn patients. At the time, it was the 5th most deadliest and destructive fire in California history. And we looked at each other and we're like, I think God hates Butte County. And that was our comment for a while. We just
Mhm.
couldn't get a break between Oroville Dam, campfire, you know, it was similar, I mean, in 1617, I think Lake, Napa, and Sonoma County kind of experienced the same thing. Every time there was a terrible fire, it just happened in those 3 counties. It was
Right.
few counties turn to take it, you know. And I think everybody in Northern California knows when we get all those fires, it just takes forever for the smoke to clear. It just pushes back and forth. And I tell my wife, I think the smoke that we breathed on Monday, it blows out and it ends up coming back on Friday, and you're getting the same smoke. Because you think, oh gosh, it cleared out, and then the wind shifts. The upper atmosphere wind shifts and blows it right back on top of you, and it can
Right.
be create for a long summer or fall until
Yeah,
we
I
get
know that throughout
a little bit
Northern
calmer.
California, the local high schools and sports teams, they were keeping their athletes inside or not even practicing well into October, early November, because it's the
Yeah,
residual smoke
because of
still in
the
the
yeah,
air.
but because of the poor air quality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, they just didn't want them deeply breathing in all that particulate matter that was still hanging around. And you could smell it. You go to a Friday night football game and even in October and you could still smell it. So yeah, it took forever to clear out. And well, this is it's remarkable to hear your description of it. And like you said, I'll point people to a couple places where they can see some of the photos that you were referring to online, either on YouTube or another news report. We'll put that in the text of the podcast introduction. But so if you don't mind, Chief, we're kind of running up against about an hour, but we've gone over so many amazing things. But coming up to today, you still live in Butte County, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so we've had a couple of years where there haven't been, well, at least one year when there wasn't a huge fire. In 2024, you had the park fire to deal with, right, in Butte County. And and that must have been traumatic for people to see that happen. So in the county, do you think people are still feeling comfortable, with the future there? Do you think people are gonna stay, or are they changing their minds about whether they want to live in towns like Paradise and Chico, places like that, given the history?
That's a great question. Um, I do feel that, the last 5 years, Butte County is definitely the bullseye of what's happening in California when it comes to fuel and weather and, fire behavior. And, you know,
Hmm.
good thing, if we want to take a positive out of this, is there's only a sliver of unburned vegetation since the campfire that's left, and that's basically Butte Meadows, Forest Ranch in between Sterling City. It's Butte Creek drainage is what we call it.
Hmm.
So we've had a fuel reset all the way across Butte County for the most part.
Hmm.
And there's a group of us, we're working on a project in Paradise right now for some long-term resiliency, and the the tone has shifted to, at least in Butte County, and we're helping that tone of, it's time to stop being afraid of fire and learn to live with fire. And I
Hmm.
think the majority of people of Butte County that want to live in the foothills and above, they really do take it serious now. Defensible space compliance is, you know, record setting.
Uh-huh.
Everybody pays attention to what's going on. I really believe evacuations, people listen to evacuations. So there are a lot of things that people are doing that are going to mitigate the next fire, at least the consequences and the effects of the next wildfire that happens in Butte County. It won't be
Hmm.
nearly as bad. It won't be nearly as catastrophic. Um, so yeah, I think some of these communities are really becoming fire wise and they're embracing it. It needs to be a culture shift, right? You can't have the attitude of, I'm going to live in this beautiful forested area. It's never going to happen to me. You have
Yeah.
to say, I'm going to have a fire around me, but I'm going to do all the things I need to do to make sure that my home doesn't burn. And when the smoke clears, we can go back to our normal living. You know,
Hmm.
I, I think, when we talk about lessons learned, for me in Butte County, recovery is really difficult when everybody's homes, jobs, schools, livelihoods burned out around them. And so recovery is easy when a fire burns through a community, but you have very little uh, public and private property law.
Uh-huh.
You're just waiting for the green to come back, for the rain
Right.
to come and wash the black away. But when we're wiping communities literally off the face of the earth, the recovery piece is really, really difficult. And that's kind of the message we tell everybody. It's okay to have fire burn around your community.
Mhm.
We just want to make sure we mitigate it enough to where it doesn't wipe the community off the face of the earth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they need their public buildings, and community buildings and schools and so forth to um, to be there afterwards. And even if some homes are lost, at least there's a place to gather, right, and regroup and start to the process of doing assessments and all that. But if you lose your fire station and your town hall and all your schools, wow,
Yeah, and
you're
your
starting
and your
from scratch,
job,
I guess, right?
yeah, you work at the grocery store and the grocery store burned down, your house burned down, the grocery store is never going to rebuild, you know, or if it does, it's 12 years from now. So, some of the differences that the Bay Area fires in 2017, there was a lot of structures that were lost, but most of them, their jobs were still there. They just went
Hmm.
down the street to the school and to the grocery store where they were. The communities that Butte County had over the last couple of years, everything was destroyed.
Yeah. And I assume there's
So
only so much you can do working together online to start your recovery. Um, Eventually, you have to have brick and mortar again to work within, um, to start building out from instead of just having a community of survivors online. Um, it helps a lot, but there's nothing like being together and sharing the experience in person, I assume.
And I think, Chris, there was some talk after the campfire about, you know, does there need to be some sort of regulations at the federal or state level that just doesn't allow you to build in these, in at the time, to just anywhere where there's,
Mhm.
vegetation or a problem of wildfire. Similar to what they do on the coastal. Hey, you can't build along the sea cliff because the cliff's going to erode and it's going to, you can't build here anymore because it's too dangerous. And I don't, maybe on the coastal it's true, but for building in rural areas of California, I don't believe that because I really truly believe there's mitigation measures. It may not, it's not going to reduce the likelihood of a wildfire, but it will definitely reduce the likelihood of an entire community being destroyed. So
Mhm.
living with fire, not in fear of fire, has got to be the message in California now. And in order to live with fire, these are the steps you need to take. Make them clear, actionable, affordable. And if you don't want to take these steps, then living in, urban, or excuse me, rural California may not be, the place for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All the assumptions about where it was safe to live, um, are have been rewritten. So, um, but not everybody is cut out for moving to a big high rise in the middle of a Sacramento or anywhere else. So somewhere there's a compromise, hopefully, um, that you can have your beautiful forested area, but live within it in a safe zone, um, that's been planned, really planned, right, for firefighter resilience and with the proper egress, um, routes and that sort of thing, need be. And the buildings are being built back and out of materials that will be less likely to send the fire from one structure to the next.
Yeah. And, you know, we talked about you kind of being the bullseye of catastrophe for a while. Now the talk is we want to be the bullseye for resiliency and recovery. And
Mm-hmm.
how do we live with fire? I truly believe there's a way that just takes grassroots effort and a cultural shift to do that. Do you want the fire to burn through your home or do you want it to burn around your home? And that's what
Yeah,
we should be striving for is we're
yeah,
gonna we're gonna have fire burn around our home, not through it.
yeah. That's the vision. That's the goal. And because, um, these areas are, um, can't be just left to, you know, to grow back unmanaged either, right? Uh, an unmanaged forest is can be a real dangerous forest. I
Yeah,
think, so. The way not only the urban areas and the wildland urban interface are come together, but also the way the vegetation around it is, if it's forested, um, hopefully the community has input into that too.
the mitigation piece of it is a really simple solution. Or excuse me, it's a really simple problem with complex solutions.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem, right? We know exactly what we need to do, which is just really hard to get there with regulations, willingness. There's all kinds of hurdles. It'd be nice to start logging California again. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know it's a lot easier to say that than it actually happening. So
It is. There's a lot of people who oppose that. So, but we're in a new world, new reality, and hopefully everybody um, can recognize that. And you can't stay still if you can't stay with old ideas because we're in a new
yeah,
world.
agreed.
Yeah,
It didn't work. It's already been proved it
it
didn't
didn't
work,
work.
right?
Grand experiment didn't work.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
it didn't work.
Well, Chief, this has been great. You've been an amazing resource and guest, and so appreciate you taking the time today. maybe we can talk again sometime, because we've got so many other experiences and major incidents in the state. So, but this one is going to stand out as one of the all-time lessons to be learned, I guess, about how a fire that is burning in a very remote area will affect the entire state of, or the entire area of Northern California, for weeks on end. And those of us who are here, remember that, and will hopefully take it with us, knowing that things are changing, things are getting better, and maybe we won't have to deal with this again in our lifetimes. I hope so. But hey, thanks again, and I hope we have
Well,
a
thank you very much for the opportunity. I
yeah,
appreciate
yeah,
it.
and
It's
I
good
hope
to
we have
keep some
a
of this fresh on people's minds.
yeah, we do. We want to capture it. It's now 6 years since it happened. And like you said, memories fade quickly. But I'm sure there are things that that'll stand out in your mind forever, vividly. So, thanks again, and I hope we have a safe fire season that's coming up, and safe wishes to all your colleagues who are still gonna be counted on to keep us safe, because we have the greatest firefighting agency in the world to depend on, and we're lucky to have you. So, well, to the listeners, then, this has been another podcast When Wildfire Comes. We'll say so long to Captain Messina for now. Take care. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks again, Chief.
And thank you for the invite.
Sure thing.